Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, October 23rd, 2025. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Trump suggests that strikes on land in Venezuela could start soon. So President Trump on Wednesday suggested that U.S. strikes on alleged drug shipments on land could be coming soon amid the U.S. bombing campaign targeting boats in Latin America. Trump has made similar comments before, and according to multiple media reports, the U.S. is preparing to bomb Venezuela with the ultimate goal of ousting Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. The president claimed to reporters at the White House that he had legal authority to launch the strikes, but Congress has not authorized the bombing campaign, which the Constitution requires for launching a war. Trump said that he may notify Congress of the plans to launch strikes on land targets, but he did not say that he would seek authorization. He said, quote, "We will hit them very hard when they come in by land, and they haven't experienced that yet, but now we're totally prepared to do that. We'll probably go back to Congress and explain exactly what we're doing when they come to the land," end quote. So, based on his language, it sounds like he could be talking about drug shipments in Mexico or something like that, where drug shipments actually come to the U.S. by land. But all the reporting, all the indications are that this is gonna mean airstrikes in Venezuela. And I mean, as I understand Venezuela, it's not a major production hub for cocaine. There is production on the border with Colombia, but for the most part, it's a transit country. So I don't think drugs are being transited through Venezuela that end up going to the U.S. by land. But it's still, again, all signs are pointing to they're going to start with airstrikes in Venezuela. So the president previously told Congress that he believes the U.S. is now in an armed conflict with drug cartels. And the way that they frame this bombing campaign is they say it's self-defense because of the large number of drug overdoses in the U.S., but that's primarily caused by fentanyl and synthetic opioids, other synthetic opioids. And that just doesn't come from Venezuela. And this is something that Senator Rand Paul pointed out in a recent interview. He's been very outspoken in his opposition to this bombing campaign and the push toward a regime change war with Venezuela. He was on with Piers Morgan this week, and he said, quote, "There is no fentanyl made in Venezuela, not just a little bit. There's none being made. These are outboard boats that, in order for them to get to Miami, would have to stop and refuel 20 times, end quote. He continued, quote, "It's all likely going to Trinidad and Tobago. There are a lot of reasons to be worried about this. Number one is the broader principle of when can you kill people indiscriminately when there's war. That's why when we declare war, it's supposed to be done by Congress. It's not supposed to be done willy-nilly. When there's war, you just kill people in the war zone. There are rules of engagement." End quote. So since September 2nd, the U.S. has bombed at least 7 boats in the Caribbean and 1 now in the Eastern Pacific, and we'll get into that in the next story. And according to the numbers released by the U.S., they have killed extrajudicially executed at least 34 people at sea without providing any evidence to back up the claims about what the boats were carrying or about who they're bombing. Sources told the Washington Post on Wednesday that any U.S. airstrikes in Venezuela would likely first target alleged trafficker encampments or clandestine airstrips, but regime change remains the ultimate goal. So one person familiar with the administration's deliberations told the Washington Post, quote, "There really is no turning back unless Maduro is essentially not in power," end quote. So the U.S. has built up a significant force in the Caribbean, as we've been covering. We've seen heavy bombers and special operations helicopters flying near Venezuela. And officials say this is part of a psychological campaign against Maduro, as well as, same thing with the leaks, this report about the CIA covert activity. The idea is that they're hoping someone in Maduro's inner circle turns on him or that he voluntarily steps down. Apparently, Trump is upset that he hasn't done that already. But realistically, that is very unlikely to happen. And so, I do believe we are headed toward an attempt at regime change, or they might just start with some limited airstrikes. But that means war. I mean, if any other country started bombing us against our will, no matter what the circumstance was, that would mean war. So this is the direction that we're headed in with Venezuela. And then the next one here, the U.S. bombs a boat that it claims was carrying drugs in the Pacific Ocean. So the U.S. military has carried out its 8th known strike on a boat that it claimed, without providing evidence, was carrying drugs. But this time, the vessel was bombed in the eastern Pacific Ocean, according to U.S. War Secretary Pete Hegseth. The previous 7 boats were targeted in the Caribbean. According to the U.S., that's the official story. And striking one in the Pacific marks an expansion of the U.S. military campaign. Hegseth said that the strike, he claimed that they killed 2 narco-terrorists, a term that the administration uses to justify the extrajudicial executions at sea for an alleged crime that does not receive the death penalty in the U.S. That, this is what they are doing now, and they're really increasing the rate at which they're bombing these boats. So, of course, Hegseth, in his statement, he put out a video of the strike. He claimed that our intelligence knew it was involved in illicit narcotics smuggling, and again claimed that they killed 2 narco-terrorists just without providing any evidence. And it's not that they're not just giving the public evidence about their intelligence. They're also not giving it to Congress. And there is relatively little opposition to this whole policy within Congress. I mean, you see some Democrats speaking out. We have that bill now introduced by Tim Kaine and Rand Paul to block war with Venezuela. There was the vote in the Senate to block these strikes, and that failed in a vote of 48 to 51, unfortunately. But just for the most part, we just don't really see much pushing against this. They're really bringing the war on terror to this hemisphere closer to home, using the same language. Even in Hegseth's statements, he says, like we targeted Al-Qaeda in the Middle East, we're going after narco terrorists in our hemisphere. So they're combining the war on drugs with the war on terror. And Hegseth did not say exactly where this boat was targeted, but a U.S. official told the New York Times that it was off the coast of Colombia. So again, on the Pacific side, in the eastern Pacific Ocean. So they're really ramping these things up. And when it comes to these strikes on boats, if they start hitting what are they going to strike on land? Are they going to start? There's a lot of planes that run this stuff. Are they going to start shooting planes out of the air? There's a lot of ways that this could go. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu denies that Israel is a protectorate of the U.S. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance on Wednesday denied that Israel was a protectorate state or a vassal of the U.S. after being questioned about the growing criticism of the U.S.-Israel relationship and Israel's reliance on U.S. military aid. Netanyahu told reporters at his office in Jerusalem before holding a meeting with Vance, quote, "Well, I want to put it very clearly. 1 week they say that Israel controls the United States. A week later, they say that the United States controls Israel. This is hogwash. We have a partnership, an alliance of partners who share common values and common goals. We can have discussions, we can have disagreements here and there, but on the whole, I have to say that over the past year, we have had agreement," end quote. And whether or not, Israel is the one calling the shots over the U.S. or the U.S. is the one calling the shots for Israel, there's no denying that Israel is completely reliant on U.S. military support and political support to carry on the way it does, to conduct the genocide in Gaza, continue the occupation in the West Bank, and wage war in Lebanon and southern Syria, and of course Iran. This would not be possible without U.S. backing. And a protectorate, like the definition of protectorate, means basically a state that is reliant on another. But then the bigger state is generally the one calling the shots. With Israel, of course, we have all sorts of Israeli influence on our politicians through AIPAC and things. So, people have varying opinions about who's really calling the shots here. But again, it's clear that Israel is completely reliant on U.S. military support to do what it has been doing, especially over the past 2 years. And addressing the question, Vance said, quote, "We don't want a client state, and that's not what Israel is. We want a partnership. We want an ally here," end quote. The U.S. vice president also appeared to respond to the criticism of the U.S. monitoring of the Gaza ceasefire and the slew of high-level U.S. officials visiting Israel this week. We had Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner go, and now Vance, and Marco Rubio is coming next. He was just in Israel very recently. So Vance said, quote, "It's not about monitoring in the sense of, you monitor a toddler. It's about monitoring in the sense that there's a lot of work, a lot of good people who are doing the work. And it's important for the principals and the administration to keep on ensuring that our people are doing what we need them to do," end quote. So I've seen the term that's being used in Israeli media is that they're babysitting. And so the New York Times reported on Wednesday that, according to several Trump officials, there is concern within the administration that Netanyahu may quit the ceasefire deal, and that the strategy right now is for Vance, Kushner, and Witkoff to prevent him from doing that and restarting the full-scale bombing campaign. And it's very clear that the Israeli government wants to blow up the ceasefire deal. Again, as we've been covering, I don't need to get into all the examples now. But the U.S. is certainly putting a lot of time and resources into making sure Israel doesn't blow this thing up, at least for now. And I think that's because Trump has really put his credibility on the line here. But we'll see how long things last like this. All right, so the next one here, Israeli Knesset advances bill to annex the West Bank during Vance visit. So the Israeli Knesset on Wednesday advanced a bill to annex the Israeli-occupied West Bank as Vice President J.D. Vance is visiting Israel. According to Haaretz, the bill to annex the Palestinian territory passed a preliminary vote in a vote of 25 to 24 and still needs to go through 3 more votes to become law. The effort was opposed by most members of Netanyahu's Likud party, which condemned the vote as a stunt by the opposition aimed at harming our relations with the United States. So the bill was introduced and supported by far-right parties, including Jewish Power and Religious Zionism, that is Ben-Gvir and Smotrich's parties, they're in the Netanyahu coalition. Just one Likud MK, Yuli Edelstein, broke with his party to support the bill, and he has reportedly been removed from the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee for the vote. And now, it's not like the Likud party is against the idea of Israel annexing the West Bank. It's just that we have had Trump recently say that he's not going to let Israel annex the West Bank. It seems like it's something they've moved off the agenda for now after talking about doing it in response to the UK and France recognizing a Palestinian state. But, and of course, they're still expanding illegal settlements, which is de facto annexation. Sometimes I think people get kind of hung up on the question of, is Israel going to annex the West Bank? When in reality, on the ground, that is what they're doing. They just haven't officially declared Israeli sovereignty over these areas yet. So the sponsor of the bill, Israeli MK Avi Moaz of the Noam party, which holds just one seat in the Knesset, he was part of Netanyahu's government before he left earlier this year. And essentially he was saying, it's our job as the Knesset to get annexation done because the government is pushing it off. And then there's a second bill to annex one settlement, a large settlement, Jewish settlement in the West Bank that has a population of about 40,000. And that bill received support from the centrist parties of Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid. They support annexing parts of the West Bank as well. So that received more votes in favor. But this was a stunt, this is something that Israel has done. There's a history of Israel approving settlement expansions when U.S. officials are visiting to make it seem like the U.S. is supporting it politically. Now, the U.S. obviously has always supported the expansion of settlements by providing military aid and backing the Israeli government the way it does. But like the Biden administration, they were saying they didn't want settlement expansion. And when Blinken went over there, they announced, some new settlements and stuff. So, things like this have happened before. This time, though, the government, or not the government, because some members of the government supported this, but the ruling party was saying they were against it. All right, so the next one here, Palestinians in Gaza bury 54 unidentified bodies. So the bodies of 54 deceased unidentified Palestinians that were returned by Israel were buried in a mass grave in central Gaza on Wednesday, as Israel returned more remains to the Strip under the ceasefire agreement. Gaza's health ministry said on Wednesday that it received 30 more bodies, bringing the total number of bodies sent into Gaza since the ceasefire went into effect on October 10th to 195. Israel has been returning approximately 15 bodies for each deceased Israeli captive sent to Israel. So you see the mass grave here. Out of the 195 bodies Gaza has received, 57 has been identified by their families. A number of the bodies were returned from Sedi Taiman, an Israeli prison, military prison notorious for torture, and the health ministry has said that some of them have shown signs of torture, beatings, handcuffing, and blindfolding. The bodies could include Palestinians who died in Israeli detention, were killed in Gaza and brought into Israel, or some who died during the October 7th attack on southern Israel. They don't know where most of these bodies came from. Hamas released the bodies of 2 Israelis on Tuesday, and they were confirmed on Wednesday to be, one was an Israeli soldier who died in Israel on October 7th, and then his body was taken into Gaza. And then another one was a civilian, an elderly man who was captured by Hamas, brought into Gaza, and died in captivity. Circumstances of his death are not clear, but we know that some of them died as a result of the Israeli bombing. So a total of 13 Israeli bodies remain in Gaza. But, there's not much conversation about all these Palestinian bodies that are being sent in, and Israel using them as leverage. There's a few times, too, when Israel just sent in like a truck full of corpses and just didn't say anything, didn't say who they were, just sent them into Gaza. And it's estimated that about 10,000 Palestinians are missing in Gaza and presumed dead under the rubble. Al Jazeera reported on Wednesday that Palestinians in Gaza City were using their bare hands or hand tools to attempt to dig bodies out of the rubble due to the lack of construction equipment. And since the ceasefire, the health ministry said that 436 bodies have been recovered. They said at least 88 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces since the ceasefire went into effect, including one who was killed over the past day. So the IDF continues to kill Palestinians in Gaza. All right, so the next one here, the ICJ rules that Israel's ban on UNRWA and aid blockade violate international law. This article is from Middle East Eye. So the world's top court on Wednesday ruled that Israel's ban on the UN's main humanitarian provider to Palestinians and its restrictions on aid to Gaza and the occupied West Bank are inconsistent with international law. The advisory opinion comes 6 months after hearings by the ICJ in The Hague, where more than 40 states and international organizations presented evidence, mostly arguing that Israel had breached its international legal obligations to facilitate the entry of aid to the Palestinian population under its occupation. Only Israel, the U.S., and Hungary disputed the majority opinion, arguing for an interpretation of international humanitarian law in favor of limiting such obligation due to military necessity and Israel's security. I mean, essentially what they're ruling here is that as the occupying power, Israel has a responsibility for the civilians, and they can't cut off aid, they can't cut off food. And that's basic international law, Geneva Convention stuff. And they also ruled that there was not that they needed to cooperate with the UN, with UNRWA, the Palestinian Relief Agency. The ruling said Israel has not provided any evidence to back up its claims that UNRWA is a tool of Hamas, basically, or I forget exactly what the Israeli claim is there, but they said they haven't provided enough evidence for that. So this is what the ruling says again about the international law. Quote, as the occupying power, Israel's obligation under the first paragraph of Article 59 to agree to and facilitate relief schemes if the local population is inadequately supplied is unconditional. The occupying power may never invoke reasons of security to justify the general suspension of all humanitarian activities in an occupied territory, end quote. This is also bolsters the case to end military aid, U.S. military aid to Israel, because there are foreign assistance laws that say you cannot provide military, weapons to a country that intentionally blocks humanitarian aid. That I felt like that was more part of the conversation when Biden was in, but we haven't seen any Democrats I mean, not that I'm aware of, in Congress, try to approach things like this using the legal tools that they have to end military aid to Israel. Just haven't seen it. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu puts architect of the GHF in a center overseeing Gaza aid. This is another one from Middle East Eye. So one of the key architects of the scandal-plagued Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has been appointed as Benjamin Netanyahu's representative at the U.S. Army's Civil Military Coordination Center, Channel 12 News reported. So this is the center opened by the U.S. military. And, I mean, this is something here. So the guy... He's an Israeli-American businessman, Michael Eisenberg, who was involved in the GHF in establishing it, and now he's going to be Netanyahu's representative to this military unit overseeing the ceasefire and aid. I mean, not a good sign. I mean, obviously, Netanyahu isn't going to appoint anybody good, but I mean, it goes to show that the GHF was, an Israeli project, Israeli-American project that was just part of the... I mean, I don't even know how to describe setting up these aid sites, so-called aid sites, so that people had to go through bullets and tank shells to try to get there, and then they could be killed there on the way back. Just so sick and evil. And so someone who played a role in that has been appointed to be involved in the new aid mechanism. And of course, Israel has not allowed nearly as much aid as they committed to under the ceasefire deal. All right, so the next one here, the IDF expands number of military sites inside Syria. So this is an article from Jason Ditz. So Israeli troops continued to expand their presence in southwestern Syria with more and more military incursions and the establishment of yet further military outposts on Syrian soil, despite negotiations with the Syrian government that are meant to see a return to the 1974 agreement, which would require them to pull back. So they've continued the incursions into some of these villages in the southwest. But so Israel invaded Syria in December 2024 after the ousting of Bashar al-Assad, and they set up 10 military outposts inside Syrian territory that they seized within the first 6 months. Well, that number has now expanded. They have 19 military posts in southwest Syria. So they're really expanding this occupation of Syrian territory. All right, so the next one here, 3 Druze killed, 4 wounded in attack on Syria's Idlib. So another one from Jason here. A gunman on a motorcycle attacked a passenger van full of Druze civilians on Tuesday in Syria's Idlib governorate, killing at least 3 Druze and wounding 4 others. Most of the casualties were women. The attack occurred in the northern Idlib countryside on the outskirts of the town of Kafr Takaram. The passengers were from the Druze village of Kafr Maras in the predominantly Druze area of Syria. So the Druze population has been targeted. This is in northwest Syria. The fighting and the massacres that we saw against Druze were in southwest Syria, but this is just a pattern of these religious minorities being targeted since the new regime took over. The former Al-Qaeda commander and his gang of jihadists, HTS, took over Syria with support from Turkey, the U.S., and Israel. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. adds sanctions on Russian oil companies. So the U.S. Treasury Department on Wednesday announced sanctions targeting Russian oil companies and demanded that Moscow end its war in Ukraine, marking the first U.S. sanctions targeting Moscow over the conflict since this Trump administration came into power. So as far as I'm aware, these are the first significant U.S. sanctions against Russia under this Trump administration. And the sanctions targeted Russia's 2 largest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, and their subsidiaries, but the measures they're not going to have an impact on Russia's decision-making when it comes to the war. Their oil industry has been under heavy Western sanctions for years now. They were probably preparing for any further sanctions, but this is really the Biden doctrine here. Add sanctions, send more weapons, and at least, what's different than the Biden doctrine is that the line from the Biden administration was, we're going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. At least with this Trump administration, they're saying that the purpose of this stuff is to end the war, although that's just not going to happen here. So this is U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He said in a statement on it, quote, "Now is the time to stop the killing and for an immediate ceasefire. Given President Putin's refusal to end the senseless war, Treasury is sanctioning Russia's two largest oil companies that fund the Kremlin's war machine. Treasury is prepared to take further action if necessary to support President Trump's effort to end yet another war. We encourage our allies to join us in and adhere to these sanctions," end quote. President Trump described the sanctions as tremendous and said that he hoped that they wouldn't have to be on for long, saying he hoped that the war would be settled soon. But, with them canceling this next Putin-Trump summit, all these reports about the U.S. supporting the long-range attacks in Russia, it's looking like this war is going to go on indefinitely, unfortunately, and people are going to continue being killed in Ukraine on the front line, and it's just it's just a real shame. It's almost 4 years now that this war has been going on, and we have another thing that happened on Wednesday was, so I covered yesterday that Ukraine said that it fired Storm Shadow missiles into Russia. Then there was a report from the Wall Street Journal saying that the U.S. did sign off on supporting those strikes. It was kind of strange because they had a similar report at the beginning of the month, but then Trump came out and he denied it. He said the U.S. has nothing to do with these missiles, no matter where they came from. We got nothing to do with it, but I think that's just not true. If they're firing these missiles into Russia, they're using U.S. targeting data. I think Trump's just trying to distance himself from it. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. bombed Somalia for the 83rd time this year. So U.S. Africa Command said in a press release on Wednesday that its forces carried out an airstrike in Somalia's northeastern Puntland region on October 20th, marking at least the 83rd time the U.S. has bombed Somalia this year. AFRICOM offered no details about the strike besides saying that it targeted the ISIS affiliate in the area and was launched in a remote mountain region about 52 miles southeast of the Gulf of Aden port city of Bosaso. They've stopped sharing any information about casualty estimates or assessments of civilian harm since April of this year. So we didn't see any statements from the U.S.-backed forces about this specific day where this strike was launched. But there was a report in Garo Online where Puntland security forces were claiming that they have been making gains in recent weeks fighting against ISIS in this remote mountainous region, fighting against this ISIS affiliate that is an offshoot of Al-Shabaab. That's the way these kind of wars go for the U.S. It's like Afghanistan. They were fighting against the Taliban for many years, and then all of a sudden ISIS-K popped up. Here in Somalia, they've been fighting against Al-Shabaab since 2007. Then this ISIS affiliate popped up in 2015, and they've been launching a whole bunch of airstrikes against them. And all the statements I always see from the Puntland forces is, we're victory. We're so, basically we've defeated them. We're very close to victory, and it just seems like it goes on. And the reason I was going to say the reason I cover this, obviously, this is something that we're going to cover at antiwar.com. But the reason why I make the headlines like, the U.S. bombed Somalia for 83rd time this year is because I want people to read it and say, what? We're bombing Somalia? Because there's no other media coverage of this. It just doesn't exist in the U.S. So that, that's the purpose for focusing on the number of airstrikes, because this is unprecedented. The U.S. has never bombed Somalia this much in a single year. And so maybe that'll get some attention and get more conversations started about why the U.S. is involved in this war. All right, so the next one here, the last story, North Korea test fires multiple short-range missiles. So this article is from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. North Korea fired several missiles into the East Sea or Sea of Japan on Wednesday. Pyongyang conducted the weapons test a week before President Trump is scheduled to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping in South Korea. According to South Korea's Yonhap News, Joint Chiefs of Staff said that it detected multiple short-range ballistic missiles. And so this is kind of, a little show of force here from North Korea. There has been a lot of U.S. South Korean war games and military drills and stuff in the region as well. And so, tensions remain high. We have seen North Korea say that they could be open to talks with the U.S. if the U.S. drops the demand for denuclearization. But I don't know. We don't really see any movement toward toward that within the Trump administration. I know Trump has said, the White House has said that Trump wants talks with Kim, but I think there's other things on the agenda now. And one thing is China and because a lot of what the U.S. does in South Korea is also about China. It's close to China, and also North Korea's relationship with Russia that has really developed in recent years, with North Korea sending troops to Kursk. So I think that the U.S. might want to just try to keep North Korea under sanctions and kind of maintain the status quo there. So that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Ted Galen Carpenter, Washington's deadly lack of foreign policy empathy toward Russia. One from Ramsey Baroud, The Irreversible Tides, Israel's Isolation and the Gaza Genocide. One from Tawu Hassan, U.S. weapons pipeline to Nigeria is becoming a crime against humanity. One from Patrick Lawrence, Volodymyr Zelensky on Desperation Row. And one from James Rushmore, How Israel Lost the American Public. So please go check all of that out. There's always stuff to read at antiwar.com, even if you watch the show. Please like, subscribe, comment. All that stuff helps us. Follow us on social media. That is it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.